maybe later on in Japan we might get some rain. Okay. Well, again, welcome back to our final installment. For the previous three sessions, what we've been looking at is the observations that have come out of basically 6 decades of CA research. So together, I think there's two main points that we could take from that. One is that interaction is organized uh, in a much more, let's say, extensive way than people had previously imagined. If you go back to the 60s, most people would have said that spoken interaction is unorganized and not worthy of examination. But now we think of all the things we looked at, how turn taking works, how sequence organization is designed, how preference organization works, how questions are designed. You realize that there's much more structure and organization than we ever imagined. And that interaction, that organization happens at a level of fine-grained detail that perhaps we hadn't imagined previously. So I think that's kind of point number one, that CA has revealed some very interesting organization. Point number two, I think for language teachers, the examination of CA lets us look at language in a very, very different light. Language is not a linguistic system. I think that's first and foremost my takeaway from this. Language is not a linguistic system, or at least we can say language is not only a linguistic system. It is part of a complex network of semiotic resources. And what we'll be looking at today in part is how that talk is absolutely inseparable from all the rest of those semiotic resources. Okay, anyway, so for the last three, we've been kind of presenting the observations and discoveries of CA. For this final session, we're focusing on the idea of doing CA. If you are interested in actually doing CA, to use CA as a research methodology, what are some of the practical realities and what are some of the problems that face and how might you go about doing it? Now, I don't know if anyone here has actually used CA to do research. Anybody? Anybody in the chat want to say anything? My impression is that no, and I'm going on that assumption, so that's fine. Okay, right. Perhaps the best thing here, let me just jump over to the presentation. I want to make sure that we have lots of time for discussion today. So we may break out of the presentation several times for discussion as well. Okay, let me go over to the presentation. Welcome. I see some familiar faces.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, let me confirm you're now seeing all of my slides.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so here we are. We're now doing conversation analysis. While we're on that word doing, I'd like to mention something you often read in CA research and can be confusing to other people. So, for example, in CA, you might hear somebody saying, talk about doing being Taiwanese, doing being female, doing being a son, doing being a child, doing being a teacher, doing being a student. So what they mean by that is that identities are flexible and dynamic within a CA perspective on interaction. And so at any given moment, you're in fact doing the act of being some particular identity. So at one moment of an identity, one moment in the interaction, you may be playing the role, doing being, a son. But that same identity may not be relevant in the next minute of conversation. So our identities, we're not all of these things all the time. So you may be male or female, but you're not necessarily male or female at this particular moment in the interaction. So you are hundreds of identities. You are perhaps, well, you are a resident of Taiwan. You are a teacher or a professor. You are a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister. You're all of those things, but you're not all of those things at the same time. So this is why we often talk about doing being. But right now we're saying doing conversation analysis. How do we begin with this? Okay, first on classroom observation. For both pre-service and in-service teachers, classroom observation has long been a valuable learning tool. It is useful for teachers and pre-service student teachers to observe more experienced teachers. It is equally valuable for new teachers to observe themselves while teaching, which of course can only be done by recording the class. Afterward, these recordings can be reviewed, ideally with a group of fellow teachers, and discussed. This is a casual sort of informal self-evaluation rather than formal classroom research. Now, I imagine most of you have experienced watching yourself teach. That can be rather uncomfortable the first time you see it. You'll say, oh my goodness, look at what I'm doing. Listen to the way I sound. Listen to all the ums and ers in my talking. It's quite surprising that first time. But I think it's a valid initial thing that you look at yourself, you'd say, look where I'm standing. Look how I am relative to the students. Look how close I am to Blackboard, how far away I am from the Blackboard. All of these kind of things, those are useful, we'll call them initial observations. But this is still quite a long ways from doing a CA style recording. Okay, now one first question I think everybody who's interested in doing CA might need to ask themselves is CA the right methodology for the job? CA is in fact a form of microanalysis, and as such, it might not be looking at the level of information that you're particularly interested in seeing. So if you're looking at, for example, where a person is standing in a classroom, if you're interested in the general patterns of interaction, like how many times, teacher talking time, student talking time, things like this, well, maybe CA is not just what you want. There's also a question of CA versus ethnography. A lot of classroom research is done with ethnography, where you're following sort of multiple lines, multiple approaches, and you're hoping that those multiple approaches triangulate and point you towards certain observations. So certainly, for example, classroom observations where you're simply there in the classroom with a notebook taking field notes. That's a completely valid form of research. Where you're interviewing teachers and or students after the fact. That's also a perfectly valid form of research, where you're showing a video of the teaching and having the students or teachers give feedback to what they're seeing. And all of these things are totally valid. Photographing the environment, capturing the artifacts of the environment, those are all very good approaches, and ethnography is a completely valid form of analysis. Now, some people then will also include ethnography and CA. That is, they will do a analysis of video, and they will add that to their other resources. And I think that's great. And it's entirely to be admired. The only thing I would say there is that the CA must be top quality CA. What you often find is people have done ethnography and they've done sort of a little kind of informal sort of CA. So sometimes people talk about mixed methodology. I say, that's great. I'm all for mixed methodology, but all too often it ends up as mixed up methodologies where you've done, each one in a sort of half-hearted way, and that won't get you good results. Now, I will say, if you're going to be analyzing, a microanalysis of interaction, then SSJ-CA is, to my mind, much better than any of the other approaches to doing conversational analysis. Okay. What is classroom interaction? We might say, oh, yeah, I'm interested in classroom interaction. I want to study classroom interaction. In the simplest sense, any interaction that happens in a classroom might be called classroom interaction. However, that's not really very informative. Lots of different sorts of interaction take place in a classroom. What teachers are primarily interested in is pedagogic interaction. That is, interaction that involves learning. So again, there's lots of things that happen in a classroom. The teacher stands in front of the classroom and gives news about upcoming events. Okay, well, that's not pedagogic interaction. You have whole class teaching. The teacher stands in the front, talks to the whole class. You have small group interaction. There's a lot of different things. And so we have to consider each one of those as a separate kind of thing. There's been quite a lot of research on the organization of traditional teacher-fronted instructions, which really represents probably 90% that everything that happens in English classes around the world. There's been less research on less traditional student-centered learning in the classroom. Recently, there has also been a growing research interest in so-called learning in the wild, which examines more informal learning interaction outside of institutional settings. So, for example, when one child teaches another child how to do something, how to play a game, that's learning in a wild. Jane, when we were learning how to play Minecraft while playing Minecraft, that's learning in the wild. So there's been a growing interest in saying this is pedagogic interaction, but it's not institutional pedagogic interaction. What can teachers perhaps learn from examining those informal types of pedagogic interactions? So there's been some recent volumes on that. Okay, now let's kind of dig into the practical realities of using CA for analysis of classroom interaction. Again, really what we're talking about is pedagogic interaction. We want to know how people are learning in the classroom, and learning is a very difficult thing to observe, to actually look and see learning happen. Like, how do you do that? CA's microanalytic approach gives us some way to tackle that. Okay, first of all, there are some practical realities to begin with. Here are the practical realities of recording. Good quality recordings. The good news is that recording devices from camcorders to smartphones are getting better and better. Okay, when I first started doing this, I had a high H camcorder. And then it went to kind of a mini DV camcorder. And when I first started teaching the master's course on CA, I was still using kind of small Sony camcorders, but much higher quality, much higher resolution, eventually getting up to 4K resolution camcorders. But my students, when they were doing their assignments, were just using their smartphones. And their smartphones themselves have an amazing quality. So that's the good news. The camcorders and the smartphones are really, in some ways, everybody has access to these things. It used to be the case that you had to like have a research budget to be able to buy camcorders. Now, just use your smartphones. Okay, unfortunately, the environments in which we use these recording devices are staying the same. You need to be aware of the ambient noise that would make doing transcription a nightmare. So let's say, for example, you say, oh, I'd be interested in recording me and my friends having dinner in a nightclub. Not a nightclub, in a restaurant. Well, that's going to be a ridiculously noisy environment. And when you have to transcribe silences and pauses and sound stretches and laugh tokens, you will just be pulling your hair out to do that. So you want an ideally silent, or let's say minimal noise sound environment. So this includes, for example, the sounds coming from air conditioners, the next classroom, or from the outside through a window. Now, for example, with air conditioner noise, that typically isn't bothering your participant, but if your camera is pointed towards an air conditioner, you will pick up that noise and it will obscure the talk. So these kind of things are very important. I always bring a pair of earplugs, plug them into my recorder, and I'm listening to the environment through the earphones so that I know exactly what the camera is hearing. Now, things from outside noise, that's an interesting thing. Your camera will pick it up, but so will the participants. So the participants may, in fact, modify their talk to conform to outside external noises. So in some ways, that's simply part of the environment. Depending on the nature of the interaction, you may also need multiple recordings from multiple positions. To the extent possible, you want your recordings to capture what the participants themselves would have been aware of. At the very beginning, in our first session, somebody asked me this question: are audio-only recordings enough? Sadly, no. Not if you're investigating co-present interaction, and that's the term we tend to use here, co-present. You have multiple people, or even just two people, there in their own physical environment. Spoken elements of an interaction and what CA analysts call embodiment are inseparably intertwined and cannot be analyzed independently. A momentary silence in the talk is not a secession in the interaction, not at all. And in fact, even beyond just talk and embodiment, we have all of the other aspects of the dynamic world in which this interaction is unfolding. Are the students using electronic dictionaries? Do they have their computer in front of them? Are they looking at a paper dictionary? Where are the papers and what's on their desk? All of these things are parts of the interaction. They're woven together with the interaction. And if we only have audio recordings, we simply won't be able to deal with this. So working with an audio-only recording may allow certain limited sorts of observations, but it cannot capture the whole picture. You would be like a blind man watching a movie. Again, you may be able to get a rough idea of what the plot is, but you really won't be able to follow the details. That said, some of the earliest CA research was based on audio-only recordings. Ideally, many of these earlier researches, these kind of research from the 1960s, were based on telephone conversations. So that's fine. Obviously, if you have audio only for telephone conversations, that's fine. However, they were also using some face-to-face recordings. For example, there was one that had to do with, what was it? It was sort of like juvenile delinquents in kind of group sessions. And that was face-to-face, but all they had at that time was reel-to-reel tape recording. So they could make certain observations, but they couldn't make other observations. However, a classroom is absolutely a co-present environment. So this sort of audio-only approach is really not suited to classroom research or pedagogic research of any real sort. Even if we're looking at online, like this sort of interaction that we're having right now, unless we had all access to the visuals involved, there'd be some element that we wouldn't have. So on the other hand, if you have audio recording devices available, I may say also available, it is quite handy to supplement video recordings with audio recordings. So you can check something that might have been unclear in the video. So you listen to it in the video, you can't quite make it out, you get out the audio recording and you play that and you say, maybe the audio recording captures it. And of course it can go the other way. Audio recording devices have become cheaper and cheaper and higher quality as well. This is always a question, where to put the camera? Well, camera or cameras. This is always a question facing the analyst. Ideally, you want the camera or cameras to capture anything that might have been relevant for the participants themselves. Can the participants see what's happening outside of their classroom door? That could be relevant. Can the students see the teacher? Can the students see the students? Can the students see the blackboard? Can the students see things that are pinned on the back of the classroom? All of these things might be relevant. For recording traditional teacher-fronted instruction, you should have at least two cameras, one in the back facing the teacher, not teaching, facing the teacher, and one in front facing towards the students. Having two cameras in front, one in each corner, would be even better. So imagine one in the back, one here, one here. So we have a kind of triangle. And those three cameras should capture most of what you'd want to see. Of course, it's the fact that you will never get everything. Participants will have access to things that you will never be able to capture in the camera. That's simply a reality. Okay, recording small group activities can be even trickier depending on how they're organized. So particularly if the participants are going to be moving around. So here's the thing that really comes up to my mind is like the idea of a CLIL-based classroom where you have an activity-based class with students moving around, going from here to there, do that. Like that would be really, really interesting to research. In fact, I think that would be a sort of key area of future research. How are CLIL lessons organized on a micro scale? That's something I think we need much more of. But how do we do it? What is the technology there? First of all, I think you might find that you would have to mic each student, have an individual kind of remote mic that you clip onto their, and to say, well, okay, we got 10 students and you need 10 mics and 10 recording devices. That can be tricky. What do you do if the participants are moving around the classroom, but you have the cameras on a tripod? Can you have an observer who follows around with a camera, just sort of doing this? Well, maybe, but every time you're pointing here, you're missing something that's happening there. So these are challenges, and there's no easy one size fits all solution there. So I think it's a case of maybe playing around with the environment, going in first and observing before you're doing your recording, and just sort of see how it looks, and then coming back with an approach to how you might do your recording. Okay, now the next, we'll jump right in. Actually, let me stop for a moment here. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment before we move into multimodality. Let's talk about the reality for and any questions you have about the kind of the physical doing of what we've talked about, either the audio and the video recordings. I see somebody has typed in, is it possible to mic every student? Absolutely, you can. I mean, I had 2 mic devices, but then of course I could only mic those 2 students involved. And these were wireless mics. They're quite nice. They're about that big in size. And it might also be a case of miking the teacher. If the teacher, for example, if the teacher is walking around through the classroom, well, you might want to mic the teacher. But yeah, so obviously, say if you're going to mic every student, that's like 40 students in a classroom, and I think right away we have that issue of saying, can we do a micro analysis of 40 students interacting with a teacher in a teacher-fronted classroom? I would tend to say, no, we can't do that type of analysis. In fact, we'd be doing something a little less than microanalysis for that. I think we have to be talking about smaller groups. So small group interaction, I think, is easily analyzed. So, okay, let's see. Yeah, I'll say, do you watch all 3 videos to analyze the interaction? I would say yes. You definitely are looking at all of those. There are some ways that you can actually align videos. That takes a lot of computing power, but you can align them. Sometimes, by the way, like when I use multiple cameras, when I start the cameras, both are started, and then I clap my hands or a knock on the desk. This gives a sync point to say the conversation, the 2 cameras are starting at that moment. But generally, I think the idea of using CA to analyze whole class interaction would be difficult unless it's very, very controlled. In a very traditional classroom, the teacher calls on students, 1 student speaks, and it's teacher, student, teacher, student. You could do that because only 2 people at a time are involved in the interaction. On the other hand, if you have situations with multiple students raising their hands, multiple students calling out an answer, they're going to be overlapping. That talk will be virtually impossible to transcribe. Okay, let's see if it's like, okay, yeah, how are CLIL lessons organized? We don't know. So like some of the videos I've watched, there's, of course, CLIL is this huge thing. A lot of things are CLIL, but I guess when I think of CLIL, mostly I'm thinking of in terms of students learning by doing something. They are planting plants. They are making drawings of plants and comparing them with drawings in their textbook. There's an activity base, and the teacher is only marginally involved. The teacher, he or she is wandering around, providing some external assistance, but it is primarily the students learning by themselves. And that is overwhelmingly in small groups. So I think it's entirely possible to record both audio and video for a small group. For example, if you have 4 or 5 students working at a table together, I think there'd be no problem taking a CA approach to that. Okay. Any other question? Anybody want to put anything else in there? Again, smartphones are great recording devices as well. You just put them in front of the students, and if everybody has their phone in front of them.
Wouldn't it be uncomfortable for the students to be videoed so closely? Would their interaction be unnatural?
Yeah, well, this is often a question like, aren't students unnatural when they're being recorded? Yeah, maybe in some sense, but what I find is, for example, if you have a 20-minute recording, for example, for the first 5 minutes they're going, and then after 5 minutes they get kind of bored of playing with the camera, and they just sort of start interacting. So it's almost like I'll do a 20-minute recording and I'll only use the 10 minutes in the middle, because maybe towards the end they're kind of saying, are we done yet? Are we done? When's the teacher going to be coming back? So people really get quite natural quite easily. This is what I've found. Yeah. So, and even when I've looked at YouTube videos, the students seem to ignore the camera quite a lot. So,
Yes, thank you. I guess we
other technical issues there?
No.
Okay. Now, a lot of this is sort of experience. The one thing I will say is that quite often you need a wide angle view. Now, I am used to, because of my own personal photography, of shooting with a wide angle. I'm used to that. I like that. But most recording devices, your smartphones, they actually, unless you have the new iPhone with your three lenses, most of them don't have a wide setting. So, for example, what the camera is capturing here is probably fairly typical, even if I move back a little bit, quite typical for a camcorder, and probably also for a smartphone, something like this. But maybe what you need is something more like that. Some camcorder companies, some camcorders allow you an adapter. So for the camcorders I had, it was like a lens that screwed on the front, and that allowed, often a very wide view like that. One advantage, I use a digital SLR for doing recording, because I can actually put a very wide angle lens on that to do the recording. Okay. So all I can say is that you give it a try, and you'll find the first time you try it, it's not that successful. I definitely recommend putting the cameras on a tripod. So if you got 3 cameras, you need 3 tripods. Position them in ways that the students will not trip on your tripod and knock your camera over. That is surprisingly easy to do. Okay, let's come back to multimodality, and why that is a challenge. Okay. Hold on a second. Okay. Conversation analysis and multimodality. Multimodal interaction. Overwhelmingly, talk takes place during co-present interaction. It is embedded in and inseparable from other semiotic systems, including the resources of the body and structure in the environment. I like to come back to that word embedded in. We have a problem here of the common sense of embedded is embedded in something. So we talk about, for example, this rock is embedded in that rock, but that's somehow false because we're not talking about talk embedded in the embodiment or embodiment embedded in the talk, but rather they form a sort of common matrix where they cannot be separated from each other. They are co-present at all the same time with all the other semiotic systems that exist. Now, back in the 60s, when CA got started, the only affordable means of recording was with these large reel-to-reel tape recorders. For this reason, the field came to be called conversation analysis because conversation is all they had. Most people today would be more comfortable calling it interaction analysis. But as time and technology have moved on, most conversation analysts now work with video recordings for interaction that occur face to face, that is, co-present. This has led to many wonderful insights, but it has also made the analyst's task much more challenging. Okay, so this is a great book, by the way. It's a large book. It's a little bit on the expensive side, but it's a great book by three of the leading experts in the field of embodiment. So Jürgen Streck, Charles Goodwin, and Curtis LeBaron, three of the leaders in this field. And the book is a compendium of articles on this field. So if you're interested in like looking into this, it will give you a good primer for how people do this kind of research and also the technologies involved. Every one of these articles will include screenshots and various sorts of devices that people have used to like how do we work with and interact, how do we work with and analyze embodiment. But first, there are these great quotes for like how do we need to conceive of embodiment? When joined together in local contextures of action, diverse semiotic resources mutually elaborate each other. That's actually what we want to talk about. So not embed. So elaborate each other to create a whole that is both greater than and different from any of its constituent parts. So we can't talk about talk and embodiment. We have to say these are both semiotic resources that join other semiotic resources as a combined, they elaborate each other. They are combined unity. And second, much existing research has avoided the crucial issues posed by the heterogeneous semiosis that sits at the center of actual human interaction by focusing on the analysis of individual semiotic systems as self-contained wholes. In a simple way, some people just look at talk. Some analysts have only looked at body language, for example. Their whole career has been entirely on body language or entirely on talk. And they simply attempted to analyze them completely separately. That simply doesn't work. That's the first observation we can make is we cannot avoid analyzing talk and embodiment together. And then finally too often, analysts regard talk as their starting point. That's what they look at. Even when talk appears late in the order of things accomplished in face-to-face interaction. Quite often, for example, when children interact with each other, it is their embodied interaction that forms most of what happens. And the talk, particularly like if you're talking about preschoolers, it is the embodied interaction that is most visibly there. And the talk is not secondary, but it would be silly to start with the talk and then look at what they're doing with their bodies. So we now, as analysts, are faced with this problem of how do we combine these things together? Okay, these are some stills that were taken from a research project that I undertook. And let me just talk about it in general, and then talking about the problems here. And then maybe I'll break from the presentation for a moment. We can talk about this. So this was an English program arranged for students at a local technical high school. Their job, they were in a robotics program, and the teacher had purchased several Lego robotics kits. These are quite fantastic kits. There's a little programmable robot, and you build a programmable, like I say, it's computer, and you build your own robot, and you give it commands, and you have it do things. And so they had the task of deciding what their robot would do. They actually already built the robot the previous session, deciding what they wanted the robot to do, analyzing how they could get it to do that, doing the actual programming, and then doing the testing. So in the upper left corner there, you have them drawing a kind of map of what they'd like it to do on a piece of paper. And the next frame at the top, they're pointing to bits of the robot for like how that would work. In the lower left, and the lower right and the middle right, you have, and also the lower left, you have them as they're in the process of putting the commands into the computer that will go into, you see them like they're pointing and gesturing, they're pointing at the screen, they're moving their hands. That's all part of how this interaction happens. And I want to tell you, it was basically impossible to do. How can I capture what's on the screen? Because I need that information because they can see it. How can I capture how they're gesturing to each other? How can I capture who's looking at who? In this case, I actually had two cameras, and then there was a third camera being handheld by an assistant. So we actually had three cameras, two fixed and one moving around. But even then, it was really impossible to capture everything. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment. And so think of the complexity if you were faced with this. And I think this would be a very good typical example of a CLIL style lesson. How would you deal with the complexity of recording, let alone analyzing, but recording it? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Okay. What would you do? How would you approach that?
What do you mean by how do we approach?
Well, like, technologically, how would you deal with that? I believe, as technology becomes smarter and smarter, there is probably some way I could have recorded what was on the screen.
Uh-huh.
Not like with my camera, but actually within, like set it up so that it was recording as a kind of screen capture thing. What is it? This OBS? Is that like that? Maybe I could do something like that.
Mhm.
And that way, afterwards, while I'm doing the recording, I'd actually have visually what was on the screen.
Yes.
And I could index that with, now they're pointing to the upper left part of the screen,
Mhm.
something like that.
Mhm.
But so I'm giving this as an example of perhaps the most complex recording environment I've ever worked in. And it was seriously challenging to the point of perhaps not being able to do a great job with it.
Mhm.
But I do think this is the kind of thing we would face when recording CLIL lessons.
I could imagine setting up 3 cameras and being able to capture all of that. But I think even after we recorded everything, like how do we go about analyzing it? And when so much is happening,
Yeah.
that
Okay, well,
problem.
that's what we'll do next. And let me say, how do we analyze it? There's so much that's happening. I think right there, that's a key phrase there, key concept. Interaction is so detailed that we simply cannot remember it. This is why you can't go in with field notes and write down what happened. And you can't remember it afterwards. And even when you watch it, it is so complex that the only way that you can understand it is with multiple viewings. You might have to watch one 20-second clip 50 times before finally you can untangle everything that was actually happening in that teeny little clip. This is why I quite often use it 10-second clips. I highlight it, I create a subclip for that, and then I could just play that same subclip over and over again just by hitting the space bar, for example, in QuickTime. So analysts talk about unpacking, and that's really what you're doing. The multiple viewings allow you to deconstruct what has happened. Okay. Okay, we're coming up on that 50-minute thing.
Yes.
But let's just say that we have to approach the analysis. There's two problems. There's one, how do we? It's still coming back to the multiple viewings. We have to view that video again and again and again. There are certain tricks and techniques that we can use. For example, fast forwarding through a video will I call that scrubbing. I think that's a kind of technical term in video editing, scrubbing, which is like you take the slider bar and you move it like that, and it sort of speeds the action. They kind of go through the action. You can go back and forth, and you can see the interactions. But you notice it will be like a dance. If you have two people in a conversation, it'll be as if they're dancing with each other when you see it at a higher speed. And so you can see as this person goes forward, that person comes back, this person leans in, that person leans in. And quite often, that will bring you to kind of obvious high points in the interaction. And you say, something happened here. And then you go back to the audio, and there's in fact something happening there in the audio. So there's these, tricks of the trade in some ways, come from experience doing this. But there's let's say there's a dual challenge. One challenge is you personally yourself understanding what's happening. And the transcription is valuable for that, but perhaps not necessary. If it was only going to be you could simply look at it until you completely understood what was happening. But the problem is for research, then we are presenting it to others. We're trying to explain to others at a conference, a conference presentation, in a publication, how that works. And now you have to have some way of putting it in some physically observable way. And that's a whole separate problem. So I tend to think of that as unpacking it, which is for yourself, and documenting it for others. Okay, let's go ahead and go into our break here, and let's come back. So you're coming back at 10 o'clock. I'm coming back at 11 o'clock. So 10 minutes from now. Okay, and then we'll jump right into multimodality.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, see you in 10. And we're back. Actually, I guess we've still got a minute or so. And according to Jane's clock there, we have 7 minutes.
Welcome back.
Yeah, okay. Here we go into our exploration of multimodality and the challenge that faces. Now, in some ways, what I'll be showing you and talking about mirrors my own journey as I was doing my PhD research and realizing more and more I had to deal with the multimodality and how was I going to do this? At the time I did this was, I was working on this in 2002. And at that time, it really hadn't become super mainstream for how people handle this stuff. What do you do? How do you transcribe it? Um, People really hadn't come up with like approaches here. So I was kind of um, going blind through the forest when I was doing this myself. Okay, let's take a look. Okay. Go forward to where we were. So we were looking at that. We were talking about the complexity of this. Now, in some ways, simply observing it multiple times was enough for me to give to really make some interesting observations and discoveries about it. Documenting those was more challenging. So here's the kind of observation I was able to make. So consider this, where we have M is the student that has the red jacket on, and J is the man on the other side, the one that he's looking at. So M says, what is that lines? What is that lines? And as he's saying that, he's looking directly into the eyes of J. And J responds with tables. M does not redirect his gaze. So what is that lines? Tables. And notice there's no silence there. There's no gap. And the fact there is no gap means there wasn't one. It doesn't mean that I didn't bother to transcribe it. It means it's not there. Okay, what is that lines? Tables. M does not redirect his gaze. So immediately, as when he finishes with tables, J switches to 3 taps on the tables. So this is what we have going on there. Okay, now J keeps his eye contact on M. So what is that lines? Now this is also kind of interesting from the point of view he's tapping. He's tapping through the paper onto the table. So kind of physical connecting it with the table. What he has on the paper in front of him is a map, a line map of what they want the robot to do. So AM is saying, well, what are those lines? What do those lines represent? They represent the actual table. Now, quite often, this is what you need to do. This is what you have to be looking for as the analyst. These kind of very subtle movements, and you're kind of going back and forth. And when the tap happens, M does redirect his gaze down to the hand. Then you kind of go back and forth, back and forth. Another thing we can look at here is notice the girl on the right. She moves her gaze. Now look at the girl in the middle. Is not at all engaged in this. So these are sort of observations that we need to make. Now, in terms of what's in the environment, let's see. What is relevantly in the environment? We can ask ourselves that question when we're talking about the whole sort of dynamic world they are in. We can say, what's relevant? Well, the piece of paper is absolutely relevant. The eraser is relevant. The robot is relevant. But perhaps also the pencil case is relevant. As how might we see that it's relevant? Because it's placed on that particular section of the desk. That particular section can be raised up and down, I guess. Okay, but is the letter a relevant item in this scene? I would say no, not at this moment. That doesn't mean it couldn't become something. Okay, again, so you go back and forth with doing multiple frame grabs for the analysis. That's my approach. Okay, but this is what I ended up with. This is the end of the PhD. At the beginning, when I was looking at how do I do this, these are some of the questions that come up. So Shegloff spoke of the granularity needed in analysis. Now, he was talking actually about the talk. So, for example, it's very clear to us now that we need to include things like sound stretches, louder, quieter voices, cutoffs, like if you say, for example, we need to include those kind of things. We need to include a very, very minor aspects of the production of the talk. This is what Shegloff means by granularity, that is, fine-grained. Conversation analysts work with fine-grained transcripts of talk, very fine-grained, more fine-grained than any other approach to working with conversational data. However, embodied aspects of interaction are often treated more coarsely. For example, you might have this very detailed transcript and then somebody puts in nods head. Well, like 1,000 ways you could nod your head, or raises hand. There are 1,000 ways you could raise your hand. So we don't tend to treat these things as fine-grained as we do the talk. And this shows in some ways that the talk is being given a superior position, which is problematic. So what level of granularity is needed in understanding embodiment? Heritage, also one of the leading people in the field, says no order of detail can be dismissed a priori as disorderly, accidental, or irrelevant. So this is sort of a fundamental position in CA. We don't know what's important. Before we do the analysis, we don't know. This is very different from the approach that was often the case in sociology, where before you even design your research, you say, but I'm not interested in this, and I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested in that. These things were dismissed before you ever came to the analysis. Well, CA, you write it all down. You write down, you document as much as you can, and then after you've documented as much as you can, you come back to it and take a look to say, how could you maybe find order in these things? Okay, so, an example of this. When I first started doing my research, I noticed that my Japanese students frequently kind of added little vowel sounds to the end of their speaking. So a very typical Japanese thing would be the same, wato izu, sato, singu, wato izu, zato, singu. And that's very typical. And so I said, I don't know what that is, but I'm hearing it. I need to write it down in my transcripts. And I tried to capture it as much as like, wata, wato, what the. So it's like, when are they adding wato? When are they adding watu? I try to capture all that because I said, I don't know. I don't know what's relevant. So it was only once I started looking at it that I realized, first observation, that's what I came to call vowel marking. Almost always was followed by a small pause. It's like, what the? And then you realize it was part of word searching, or possibly what you might think of as grammar searching. They were looking for ways forward because you'd find the very, very same speaker would go, for example, what game? So you realize, well, it's not a pronunciation issue, which most teachers in Japan would assume it's a pronunciation problem, and you have to treat it as a pronunciation problem. You have to try to cure it as a pronunciation problem, where you say, no, it's an interactional resource that they are using to manage their interaction. Now, here's an example. Like if you say, I went to, you can stretch that to out as long as you want. I went to Kenya. That was actually one of the lines from my research. I went to Kenya. But if your word happens at the end with a final stop, like what, you can't stretch a what. The only thing you can do there is what, and then they would add the what, the, and they would stretch that. So what's a native speaker doing? Very simple. What, and there's the solution. You teach and the o, u, and e disappear. So you give them the resource they need for English, they can replace their Japanese resource with that. Okay, so again, this is an example of saying, I didn't know ahead of time what was important, so I just tried to put down everything I could. Final point that we have to realize, we say gesture. Like if I asked everyone here to wave to the camera, well, all of your waves would not be identical. There'd be lots of different waves. If we say pointing, well, think of all the different ways you might point. So gestures are malleable. They are like made out of rubber. You can point. I've seen video where somebody is pointing with their shoulder, like, what did he say? What did he? And they're sort of gesturing because their hands are busy with something else. What did he tell you? People point with their knees. They point with their toes. They point. Well, almost any. Well, all gestures. Anything you do with your body can be done incrementally. It can be done in a strong way and a weak way, anywhere in between. So these are problems that we have as analysts. Okay, now this comes to the next problem, not the unpacking of it, not the seeing of it, but the transcribing of it. Now, transcribing, I like to talk about the act of transcribing versus the transcript. For me, the act of transcribing is much more important. That's where you, the analyst, really come to terms with what's there. You dig into the details. But the actual physical result of the act of transcribing is the transcript. And we do run into some problems there. Okay, so this would be something was quite typical. I would see this a lot at the beginning. And I might have transcribed this little bit, like what is that lines? Tables, and then the double parentheses is used in CA to indicate embodied things. J weekly points past M to other tables. And in line 4 there, J switches to 3 taps on the tables. Okay, one can assume since it's line 3 and line 4, that line 4 happens after line 3. And M then says cables, has misheard that word. And J then lightly retaps 3 or 4 times and repeats tables. Then there is a 0.6 second silence. But again, we say, well, 0.6 seconds silence. I'm quite certain there was no cessation of the interaction. Something was happening during that half a second, but I haven't captured it here. Now I do have in line 9, I have unintelligible in overlap with the teacher. That is, the teacher said something and that obscured what M said. Then we have 10, 11, and 12, where M points to drawing, M begins to rotate paper, J establishes control of paper. Ah, did you mean those? Rotates to point to other tables, these two tables, and the little square bracket at the beginning, those indicate overlapping. So done at the same time. Okay, now let's take a look at that. Now we look at that and say, I did the transcription. I watched the videos. I know what happened, but I'm quite certain that no one else looking at that transcript could possibly understand how that worked. It simply wasn't sufficient to communicate to other people. So I've thought about this, like certainly overlapping. In this case, I have three participants, K, A, and S, and they're all co-present and their bodies are all working together. They're in the dance. So it was very clear I needed to capture what they were all doing at the same time. So I thought of this idea. After each bit of talk, I'm going to give these tables, and then in each table, I would indicate what K is doing, what A is doing, what S is doing. And I thought I could maybe capture like the overlapping of embodied movements using this. Immediately, it became apparent I couldn't type it. Typing simply wasn't going to work at all because, the length of a word and the length of the gesture aren't the same. And I thought of trying to write it by hand, just using a pencil. And that obviously was very quickly, immediately, was clear that that wasn't going to work either. So as a step forward from here, I moved, actually, I've skipped over one here, see, right? Yeah, so I'll come back to those two. I moved to this. So now, instead of those descriptions, I actually had a frame grab from each of these. So we have the talk, and then the frame grab, the first one at the top, is intended to mean what happened during the 0.73 second silence. But there are a couple problems here as well. Now, first of all, once we say, now in the next one, I needed to have three different frame grabs to capture the movement within that 1 second silence. But the problem there was, once I published those three little, they'd be the size of a postage stamp and nobody else would ever be able to see what I intended to mean there. A further problem is, for the top one, we can ask ourselves, where in that 0.3, in the 0.73 seconds, did that particular movement occur? Was it in the first 10th of a second? Was it in the last 7th of a second? That would be relevant. And yet that information is missing here as well. But I mean, it's a step better. It's certainly better than writing it in brackets. It's definitely better than my next attempt at the tables, but it's still not entirely satisfactory. Okay, let me come back now. People always ask, what about the transcription software? That's often the very second question. I'm going to do CA. What camera do I need? And what transcription software should I buy? Well, there are two that are commonly used, but the sad fact is neither one of those transcription software will save you from the harsh reality of having to do transcription. My transcription is all just done in Word, which is perfectly fine. But there are two others that I'd like to show you. The first one is called CLAN. This is actually freely available. You can just Google CLAN and you'll come up with the CLAN transcription software. And it has some fairly amazing things, but the analyst, of course, is still having to individually type in. So everything you see typed in here, an analyst has typed in. But you can also enter in a video, and then you index the video with the talk. So as you see here, there's one of the lines, the how are you is highlighted. That highlighted how are you is the frame that's being shown right now in the movie. So when you click play on the movie, it will actually move through the transcript. It's the same thing you see when you see YouTube today. When you see the YouTube auto transcriptions, it's moving through these. Okay, as to use CLAN, CLAN was originally designed to use with people doing child language analysis. That's where the CLAN comes from. And people were using it to analyze like infant talk, how like 1-year-olds develop language into 2 and 3-year-olds. But it's become a very, very commonly used tool for CA analysts as well. And it has a number of advantages. One advantage is that each one of these lines can be expanded. So for example, if we're looking at the top there at I see. Yeah, let's say if we're just looking at, well, let's say line 17. Line 17, how are you? We can expand that line so that it has multiple tiers. So a tier levels. So kind of my idea, but what you'd have here, for example, let's say this was in Chinese and you transcribe it in Chinese. By the way, if you're transcribing in Chinese, you can't just write Chinese characters. You, in fact, have to transcribe it in a more or less phonetic way, because you have to be capturing how that Chinese was actually said. Were there any cutoffs? Were there any laugh tokens? Were there any in-breaths? Were there any sound stretches? So you may, in fact, have to include some sort of phonetic, alphabetic sort of transcription. This is the norm for everybody working with a non-Roman script doing CA, whether that's Russian or anything else. Okay, so beyond that, if you say, yeah, but I would also like to give the viewers of this a word by word breakdown of what the Chinese is saying. So how do you say, how are you in Chinese?
你好吗?
Okay, ni hao ma. Okay, let's say in the next line, you'd want to have a what's ni, what's how, what's ma. And how about what would you say as an English translation? Ni?
I don't know. Ni is you.
Okay, and how?
How is good?
And ma?
Ma, I don't know how to explain that. It's
So
just
there's not a translation. You just have to describe it from a grammatical perspective. I mean, I happen to know that. It's a grammar particle that marks question, right?
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, you'd give that. So imagine you have that. It's a literal breakdown of exactly what the pieces are in the exact sequence. So you're not translating it. You're giving the reader what the pieces are so they can do the analysis along with you. And then you might want to open a third tier. And on a third tier, you could give a kind of informal translation. Let's say you wanted to say it's something like, how's it going? If you thought that that was closer to, what you're trying to capture. And then you can even open a third tier that you can put a frame grab in there. So you can actually have as many tiers as you want to add in layers of information. You could include another tier where you had this actually written in Chinese script. So this is one of the advantages of CLAN. You can work with these multiple tiers. One problem, I think a bias that CLAN has, from my point of view, if we could jump back real quick, dun, 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 dun. Too often, analysts regard talk as their starting point. dun, 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 dun. From my point of view, CLAN emphasizes talk over the embodiment. And of course, as language teachers, we tend to focus on that ourselves. We're interested in the talk. But I think it may cause you to make certain observations and not make other observations. So I think it's not a crucial failing, but it's something that if you're using this, I think it's important to keep that in mind. Okay. Right. The other one, so CLAN, and the other one is Transana. I don't know if anybody has heard of that one. It's quite different. And, this one, I'm going to say that CLAN has a easier learning curve. Transana may be more powerful, but has a more complex learning curve. It does take some effort to learn how to use Transana. But again, it may actually be more powerful and has some advantages. As I've written up there in red, the analyst is still doing the transcription. So there is no automated transcription, unfortunately. So even though YouTube is doing auto transcription, one, it actually makes maybe a 5-10% error. But more importantly, it cannot do the fine-grained transcription that CA needs. It can't put in the silences. It can't distinguish between a pause and a gap. It can't distinguish between a long and short O. It can't distinguish between a cutoff word, help, and help. So in the end, it still comes down to the analyst learning CA transcription and typing it in, like in this area down here. And then you load your database of video files over here. And then it will play sort of, to me, it's kind of strange in the sense that the video, sections of the video will play across sort of horizontally, which again, it's not here nor there. It also includes this visualization, which can be very useful. So the waveform. And if you can learn to read the waveform, you can see, okay, look right there. That flat line is very probably a silence. And you could listen to that, and you might even be able to use this to time the silences. So Transana, but Transana is paid for. I don't know whether it's I don't know whether you buy it out or subscription based. I know that one researcher can get it, and then other members of his team can also use it. So there's some sort of more complex licensing with Transana. So you got CLAN, Transana, or just plain Word. And if you're going to start off, you just plain Word. Okay, and for the video, I was just using QuickTime. Sadly, QuickTime has changed, and it no longer does the things I used to do with it. So progress in this case made it worse. So unfortunately. Okay, so now this is what I finally ended up doing, not for everything, but for certain aspects of it. So now, instead of putting I've turned things around. In this case, I inserted the frame grab into the talk. In this one, I've inserted the talk into the frame grab and added further information. So this moment, patto, and then there's a sign, mazaz, and that's mother, mazazu, and that ooh there, that stretch, mazazu, there's the stretch, and I've indicated the red triangle there indicates this is the exact moment that her hands are in this position. And this is the kind of fine detail that I needed to make the analysis I did. Now, as this. So as she's mazazu, mazazu, as she's doing the oo, she's tracing a pregnant belly. She, in fact, never produces the word pregnant. None of them could come up with the word pregnant. But they all got like, oh, mazazu. And then the other two actually jumped in as, and they did a choral repetition of the gesture. But so the red arrow there was a way of directly tying the moment of the video with the moment in the talk. So now we have a good interaction, an interlocking alignment of talk and embodiment. Now, of course, this takes a lot of time, and you can't do it for everything. So you really have to pick and choose. What are you going to be presenting? What do you want to talk about? What do you want people to see? Okay, here's another, what has been called an augmented transcript. These are needed to capture multimodal interaction. So this was a case of children playing hopscotch, and they were looking at this. These were, in fact, Spanish speakers, Spanish children in Southern California. And you can see the kind of different things here. So up in the upper right, we actually have just a drawing that shows what a hopscotch, let's see, what do you call it? Hopscotch square? That's not right. The hopscotch thing looks like. That's relevant information. So all children participating in this understand that this is the structure. They understand which one is the 4 box and the 5 box, even if those numbers may not actually be written on their particular game grid. So, but they know this. This is part of knowledge of how you play hopscotch. And so the person has included that, which we might think of it as a kind of map. And then he's done drawings here. He doesn't have videos, and like, why not? Well, whole new issue, privacy. This has become a major issue to say, can you legitimately use a picture, particularly of a child, that you're going to publish it, or a picture of an adult for that matter? Can you include actual pictures where people are recognizable in a publication? Certainly at American universities and with American publications, that has become very problematic. How about there in Taiwan, Jane?
I think we like when we conduct research and we go through IRB process as well, but for publishing, I don't see a lot of photos with kids in them.
Okay. Now, so, I mean, it has become quite extreme in the US that you, as the researcher, you have to tell the Human Resource Board who will hold the tapes, which locked cabinets they will be put in which office. This kind of detail is then required. And partly it's, I think in some ways it's the Human Resource Board, but it's also the researchers themselves are becoming more attuned to the issues of privacy. And so, like in this case, I'm looking at this, this is Charles Goodwin, and I think he has used Photoshop, like one of the filters in Photoshop, to kind of reduce the video into these kind of, I mean, you could tell there's still details there, like left in the clothing, but he has also cut out the background. So he has removed information. I have to say that bothers me as a photographer, I guess, the idea of saying you removed information.
But that's a good idea.
And so I guess the thing is, like, when he was doing his analysis, he had that. He was looking at the actual video. And he decided what was relevant in terms of doing a presentation, and decided in terms of the presentation, he didn't need that further information. I should also mention that we have names here, Carla, Diana. In CA, they never use the actual names. You're always using pseudonyms. Sometimes it's just C and D. Other people like to use a whole name, saying these are real people. Let's give them a real person name. In this case, these are real person names that happen to also be Hispanic names. So again, what you have there on the top picture of the girls jumping, you have the bean bag, an indication of there's some object that is an artifact that is relevant here, and a little line indicating what that is. You have the original Spanish conversation that was going on, and then on the side we have the kind of line by line English translation of what they're saying. Notice he has tried as best he could to include aspects of the vocalization even in that. So, for example, say, y tú vas en el cuatro, y tú vas en el cuatro. There's a strength in that first syllable. So he's tried to put that into English, and you go in the four, the same way with the fifth. So he's tried to capture as much as he can here to communicate for a published article. Here's another one of his papers, The Semiotic Body and Its Environment. These are great papers. In this case, he's working with archaeologists and dealing with what archaeologists need to learn to see. He has another paper, by the way, maybe one of his best paper if you're looking one. It's called Professional Vision. I think I might have a link to that at the end. Professional Vision. And what this is many kinds of experts, from plumbers to archaeologists, need to learn to see what is relevant in their work environments. So if you, as somebody untrained in archaeology, were to come to this site, you wouldn't even see what they're looking at. They might be pointing to something in the dirt, and for you, it's just dirt. And for them, they might be noticing color differences between the dirt that to them indicates structure. So part of becoming a professional in any field is actually learning to see. So that article deals with aspects of that. So in this one, he has, see, what has he got? Well, he's got this is sort of similar to what I did with inserting the picture between. And in this case, he's used a bracket. So there's just sort of circling, and he's got an underlying bracket that's pointing with a line that's pointing down to where her brush is. I think it's a brush, as she's saying that. And then in the upper right corner, there's another little miniature picture inserted there to show a close-up of what it is she's touching with the brush. Okay. Next here has to do with embodied participation. Interaction involves skilled local negotiation, utilizing the resources of co-present body, structure in the environment, as well as talk. Turns at talk and turns at action. So this is kind of a debate here. Before I read the rest of that sentence. There are some people who would say talk is organized in turns. We take turns talking. And for example, Shagoff would say very strongly, we take turns talking. We do not take turns with our bodies. There are some people who might argue that, but I think it is reasonable to say turn taking happens primarily with talk. It's not my movement, your movement, my movement, your movement, but rather the bodies are kind of co-moving. Okay, so turns of talk and action are often preconditioned or foreshadows by strategic positioning of the body. One example, if somebody is going to start speaking, quite often they lean forward. And it's the leaning forward that suggests to the other participants they have become engaged, they are perhaps going to speak next. Likewise, through the visible withholding of embodied engagement, participants minimize active participation. The degree of embodied engagements appear to be a very good predictor of verbal participation. Now, I think as teachers, this is a really valuable point for us to take. We can look at classes, we can look at students from a distance, and we can see which people are physically engaged in the action and which are not engaged. It has been my experience that the people that are physically disengaged are also verbally disengaged. So if we want to, now we have to turn that around. If we want more verbal engagement, perhaps we need to manage more embodied interaction. So I get this point of saying, I keep thinking of things like theater departments have people do these physical activities that are designed to like get them sort of going, get the juices flowing. Some are kind of crazy and weird, like they'll have everybody lay on the floor and they'll say, pretend you're a bunch of ground worms, and you're just supposed to sort of wiggle around. But certainly allowing body movement, sort of producing an environment that is conducive to body movement, may be a key factor in getting the verbal participation. Certainly having people sit in desks with their hands in their laps, that will almost certainly restrict the amount of verbal participation they do. Now, I had a good example of this I'm going to show you here. Okay, projecting participation. So right away here, looking at that, who is engaged in this interaction?
The men in the pen.
Okay. So let's put it, let's say, if we number it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 is the most engaged, going down to least engaged. Who's most engaged?
3, and then 1.
Well, describe it. I don't know who. So who? Like describe the person.
The person whose writing is the most engaged.
Okay, I'd say that's the most. Okay, number 2.
And then we need to decide whether it's the girl sitting next to him with the pink
pink hair pin or whatever.
Yeah.
Hair clip.
Yeah. Or the I'm not sure. The guy in red.
Okay. And the least engaged.
I'm not sure whether the guy in red is the least engaged or the girl who's sitting on the
right. Let me ask a few questions here. Does the guy in red look comfortable?
He looks pretty comfortable.
You think so?
Like laying back on the
but his arm just isn't on the desk. It's like stretched way out on the desk. Why do you think he's got his arm? I mean, that wouldn't be the comfortable position. The comfortable position would be just, he's just relaxing over here.
Okay,
but
so
his whole shoulder is leaned forward. I have to lean back to he's like way back like this. And say, why do you think he's doing that?
So perhaps he wants to be engaged and
let's take that. What does he want? He wants what?
Perhaps point something on a paper,
Okay.
giving some, comments or something.
Okay, wants to point to something on the paper, I think is a possibility. Anybody else want to make a comment?
Yeah. Anyone else?
Jump in.
Professor Wu and Wei Zhen 老师. Would you like to grab the mic? Go ahead and grab the mic instead of just typing. Feel free to jump in.
So if everybody wants to unmute their mics, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah,
I
please.
think it's an upside down. He's in the upside down position. So, and he really wants to talk and join the discussion.
The one in red, you think?
Yes, I think
Yes. Okay.
she's referring to the one in red.
Right. Now, I like to think of this in terms of the resources here. So not just the bodies and the talk, but what are the other physical objects here that are relevant to these participants?
Physical objects.
Yeah. So what's on the table there?
The ruler, the eraser.
Okay, the ruler, the eraser,
the robot.
The robot.
the robot. Okay. Now, by the way, next to the robot, that's actually a little sound recorder that's on the desk there.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some other sheets of paper.
Mm-hmm.
There's the pencil case. And how many pins are there?
Only one.
One. Okay, what is the central resource for what's going on here?
Only one person can write.
Yeah, only one person can write. There's only one map being created. That piece of paper that the map is being drawn on is somehow the central resource of this interaction. And my claim, what I would say is that the man in red, he wants that piece of paper. He wants that piece of paper and he wants that pen.
The red man wants to write something, right?
That's and in fact, that's actually what happens as you play the video forward. He does in fact manage to take physical control of the paper and the pen, and then he is end up drawing kind of modifications on what the man in the other jacket has written. So the fact that he's leaned so uncomfortably forward is a resource for us to know he wants something, and then we can use the other resources, the fact that the paper is somehow key, to make some sort of idea. Now, the other things that we can perhaps say, the woman on the right is certainly more engaged than the woman in the middle. And we can ask kind of why that is. Now, partly I have a little more insight into that because it's her paper and her pen. So all the paper and pencil case on the side there, that's all hers. So,
but she's the least engaged.
Well, I would say that she's more engaged. Her hands are at least on top of the desk. She's looking at him right. The other girl is looking at him right, and her hands in her lap. Now, of course, the problem, we're looking at a still, and a still isn't the moving video. If you watch the moving video, you would see that the girl in the middle is like a statue. She's simply entirely frozen. Her body doesn't move at all. And I think we've all had students like that. It's like they're simply afraid to engage physically with anybody else. You might call these people shy. But in that sense, the girl on the right, there is minor movement. You see her hands kind of shift around a little bit, but the girl in the middle does not shift her hands or her head or her shoulder or her hips or anything, except at one moment, and we'll say that in a moment. So right now, if we're going to say, who's going to talk next? I think it's quite obvious at this point, we'd say that M, the man in red, is going to be the next speaker.
Yes.
He has used his embodiment to make a claim on the next turn. Okay, so A was assigned the task of recording the group's plans. This is what the teacher intended. Okay, as a way of making everybody engaged. They say, teacher says, okay, you you are recording everything, and all the other people have to tell you what to write. Very common teaching activity. Well, it didn't work that way. Almost immediately, the men in the group took control of the paper. So, but the pen and the paper still belong to her. Jay currently controls the resources for completing the task, the paper and the pen. M's extended arm not only displays his active engagement, but also makes a claim on the central object in the task, the paper. Okay. And then finally, Y displays the least degree of embodied participant. This is her base position throughout the data. For the whole recording, this is what she looks like, except for very brief moments where she moves out, and then she always comes back to this base position. Okay, now we can talk about embodied disengagement. If a potential participant is physically disengaged from interaction, that individual may not be able to re-engage quickly enough to step into the rapid changing flow of events. Deep physical disengagement, for example, the girl in the middle, also renders the individual opaque to other potential co-participants, and thus calls into question his or her status as a participant. By opaque, I mean, if she's not moving, if she's not displaying anything, they can't read anything. They can't read whether she understands. They can't read whether she is interested in participating. She can't read whether she might take a turn. She becomes like a physical object, like a box to the co-participants. And this really says, is she truly a participant if she is so completely opaque to the others? Degrees of physical engagement are to some extent culturally and individually constructed, but nevertheless can act as a barrier to effective interaction. So there's a kind of problem we could say, okay, let's Americans like to do this, and maybe Japanese don't. Although a better way of describing gesture is often in terms of gesture box. So that what's the size of your gesture box? Americans might have a gesture box this size and work in that. And maybe a Japanese box is smaller, so their gestures seem smaller. And maybe Italians have a much larger gesture box. I don't know, how would you describe, let's say, how would you describe, let's say, high school age Taiwanese people interacting with each other? Are they physically, they physically moving their arms around while they're talking?
I think it depends on the person's character. Like if it were Maddie, he's
well, yeah, I mean, that's always going to be different. Like this American, that American, this Japanese, that American. But let's say if we're talking as a whole, would you you spent some time in the U.S., would you say that Taiwanese are physically as active when speaking as Americans are?
I think Americans have more, body language than Taiwanese students.
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, the Japanese seem to have less to me. Yeah. One thing that drives me nuts, but it's very common, they speak with their arms hanging limp on their sides. Having a conversation and their arms are just hanging. It's like a soldier at attention, but they're sort of relaxed. Mm-hmm. And the arms are, their palms are simply hanging down by their knees. And they don't seem to feel a great need to move their arms. Now, obviously, some are very engaged, but I tend to think this lack of physical engagement is something that can act as a barrier for spoken interaction. So limited physical engagement can therefore become a barrier to active language learning. one good reason to say get students out of their desks. That physical desk is a restriction on their body movements. So instead, get them standing around in little groups. Get the CLIL classrooms where they're moving around, doing an activity.
That's why I like it in the States where there's a big carpet and they would have carpet time.
Say that one more time.
As I observed classroom in the States, they would have carpets in the classroom and they would have carpet time, or whole class would be sitting on the floor listening to the.
So like a typical, let's say, typical elementary school, first, second grade, do they have desks in those classrooms, in the American classrooms?
They do have desks, but they have an area where they could sit on the floor and,
Okay.
not at their desk, but interacting in a circle or in front of the teachers.
Actually, the very first thing when I go to any classroom that I've been assigned, I go in there and I look, how can I make an interaction space in this classroom? And sometimes, honestly, it's tough. They got, we've got lecture halls where you have bank desks that are screwed down onto the floor. But you always have there has to be someplace. Maybe it's to the very front where the podium is. Maybe it's in the very back of the classroom. Maybe it's the space along the side of the wall. Maybe I can move the desks out to the side and create a central space for activities. But I'm always looking for that physical space. One time, as an experiment, this was a conversation class, I actually had all of the desks removed from the classroom for the entire semester. There were like no furniture in the classroom. And it was an interesting experiment, but very difficult for Japanese who couldn't imagine sitting on the floor. And the floor is dirty. And of course, just practical things like, girls come to school in miniskirts. And it's like, so I realized that really wasn't going to work. So, but it was sort of interesting to say people kind of sat around in little self-organized groups. And I think we got better interaction because of that.
That's wonderful. It's 10:55. Would you like a short break?
Okay. Yeah, let's see. Let me just see kind of where we are. Okay. Actually, let's do this. Let me go through this. We're almost at the end of this presentation, and then I'm going to go into a question period. And I'd like to really spend, like a half hour on question. If we have, there's other things I can add at the end, but I'd like to address this question about translanguaging and transcription. That is, more and more we're accepting the idea that we might have multiple languages happening in the classroom in pedagogic interactions, and that's okay. For a long time, there was this very strong resistance of like, don't speak Chinese, don't speak Japanese, only speak in English. But we're relaxing that a bit to say, why shouldn't we allow students to use the resource of their first language in helping each other out? Why shouldn't a teacher be allowed to use the first language, for example? And I think that's all about, that argument is about using it effectively. So not avoiding the second language, but rather strategically using the bits of the first language when it's helpful. But that brings up the question, if you have, for example, bits of, if you have words, individual words, or even a whole sentence in Chinese, for example, in your recording, what do? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you can't write it in Chinese. If you're using CLAN or one of the ones, actually Translanguaging also provides the tiers. You can provide the written Chinese in its standard form as one of the tiers. But to do the transcription, to do CA analysis, you need to include all of the production features, loud voice, soft voice, cutoff, stretches, tenth of a second pauses. You need all of that. So somehow that has to go into the Chinese. So obviously you can't put that kind of stuff in, written. You can't put it in kanji in Japanese, and you can't put it in Chinese, and you can't put it in syllabary. You can't put it in hiragana or katakana or any other. You can't put it in Arabic. So for any non-Roman script, you need to somehow Romanize it. What is the standard way of Romanizing Chinese?
That I'm not familiar with.
If there isn't a way, maybe a case of, I think of like pinyin is used in mainland China. Isn't that a Roman writing?
Oh,
I may be wrong.
Yeah, one of the participants is using pinyin. I don't know how to pronounce it in English.
Yeah, I don't either. No, I've just sort of seen it written. I'm not entirely certain, but for example, like when in Beijing at the Olympics, when they were putting up the names of the sites, well, they put those up in English letters. It was actually still in Chinese, but it was in English letters. So, or rather, Roman letters. That's what you'd have to do in terms of doing your transcription. You'd have to do that. Okay, and again, you do that on a separate tier. Okay, now it's exactly the hour, so let's take our break. Let's come back in 10 minutes, and then we'll have 50 minutes to questions. And if people want to go back and revisit the idea of making textbook dialogues real, we can look a little bit at that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
See you in 10. Hello. I accidentally kicked myself out of the meeting. I was moving my mouse across and clicked on the leave meeting button. Hello, Shuta. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Okay, let's see. Looks like we have about roughly 70 people here today.
Yep.
Okay, I'm seeing what just came up all here. Okay, it says your video was paused and suddenly it was like everybody's problem. Video is paused due to problems with your network. Okay, that's disappeared, so maybe that problem is solved.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me recommend that everybody get your chat box open up so we can see both messages in chat. So what I'd like to do here, I would like to open this up to any kind of questions, discussions, comments about any of the things that we have looked at in these 4 sessions. It can be the first session having to do with turn taking and sequence organization, preference organization, design of questions, or the whole issue of doing CA for yourself, and even the very broadest thing, CA's relevance to language education, and anything at all here. In fact, I'll even say, go ahead, and if you want to type a comment or idea in Chinese, I say, go ahead and do that. And then somebody else can perhaps pick that up and run with it.
Okay, well, I think while everybody is thinking about their own questions or, still typing in the chat, I'll start with my question. Last session, you talked about questions. They're not actually questions, but we're teaching them.
Doing other social actions, primarily, yeah.
Yeah. But the way the Taiwanese elementary school English textbook is set up is, including all these different questions, and
I assume they're being taught primarily as from a grammatical perspective, as I mentioned before, that first introduce questions with present tense be, next introduce maybe does questions.
Yeah, and it's like a CLT base and they're dialogues, and they just pick out a question and answer form and do some drilling or information gap type of activity in class.
Right.
How do we go about stepping away from that? And
I think first thing for anything is always teacher awareness. Once the teacher realizes that that's not all that there is, and once you have this awareness that where were you yesterday is quite often a complaint, then you can find a way to get that into your thing. And I think if you're talking about, you can also come up with more realistic examples. So if you're coming up with do you questions, 2 things there. One, to get across at a simplest level that do you is about habits. And once you get that message across, which I think is quite easy, kind of come up with, do you brush your teeth every day? Do you take a bath every day? Do you do your homework each night? And I think very quickly the students will, get that sort of habitual nature of that, particularly with the do you. And let's say from there, the next step up, and this might not be with elementary, but it could be with fifth, sixth graders, would be more like realizing that these are not purely innocuous kind of questions. Like if you say, for example, let's say, do you take pictures? Okay, let's say, do you take pictures? There's always that next step, that activity. I said, well, like, why? Why did you ask me that question? This sort of why that now, and somehow increasing the sensitivity to that, even if it's just the teacher coming back with why, and them coming back with something. So many of these do you questions function as pre-sequences of various sorts. Certainly the do you like, and do you like, do you have, those are pre-sequence questions overwhelmingly. As far as the unnaturalness of I particularly hate these grid form information gap that, like, every textbook publisher has decided, if I include these, people will buy my book.
I know,
But they really are awful. If you actually like write out the questions and the answers they produce, it's very unnatural. And I think it's possible to maybe redesign those or reconceptualize how they're done, or put them in some sort of context. There's nothing wrong with the idea of information gap, although even there's a certain, the assumption is that language is primarily transactional. You often hear that word, transactional language versus social language. And the information gap expresses the idea that you ask questions in order to receive information. But that may not be exactly the purpose here. I'll say personally, I just skip them. I just don't do those at all. Those pages, I just go to the next page, and I'll come up with my own activities there. But I guess that, all you can really say is that teachers, particularly in the public schools, have a lot of restrictions. I'm sure in Taiwan, there's just as many restrictions they have here in Japan. And they say, you've got to go through this amount of the curriculum, and you've got this many days, teaching days, to do it. And there are going to be these tests on that material. All you can say as a teacher is to say, you will always have some free time. You always have some choice. What do you want to do with your free time and your free choice? If you know these ideas you got from CA are out there, when you have some free time, you bring them in. That's an elaborate answer. Kind of waiting for somebody else to type a question or to.
Yeah.
Why don't you pick somebody? Unfortunately, I can't read their names.
I'm not sure if anyone here is interested or planning on doing, actually doing CA research, and
that's perfectly fine. I think in that sense, my message to those people is that language may not be what you think it is.
Yeah.
Language is not a well-organized system, which is the picture that we hold. There's a great quote that says, your picture of language will greatly influence how you teach it. And that is, most people do think of language as a very well-organized grammatical system. It sits like right up there in your brain, and your job is to reproduce that system in the brain of your students. But CA moves it out of your brain and says, this is social interaction. It's people being people together. And that's got to be then your new role as a language teacher. you're an interaction facilitator.
Mm-hmm.
How about just, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was wondering if any of the participants is an elementary school English teacher and could show us some of the conversations that are in the textbook. Okay.
Yeah, well, that'd be great to see if somebody can either type. Oh, well, let's see. Okay, so this is good. I was thinking how to create natural questions in class when doing conversations in a restaurant setting. It seems quite difficult for questions to ask, or for students to ask questions. Very interesting thing. If you ask students to write, for example, imagine you've gone to McDonald's, and they have gone to McDonald's many, many times, but you ask them to write a dialogue of what you do, and what they will write will not match what happens in McDonald's. For example, like who speaks first in McDonald's? Well, it's absolutely going to be the person behind the counter. And what do they say? And what do you say? And what do they say? And what do you say? It's often quite different. So maybe the first thing is sort of for the teacher to sit down and kind of say, well, what, when you go to a restaurant, what do you actually say? What is the sequence of events that takes place? So let me come back to that again in more detail. Say there are approaches where people are now they're looking at actual research. Like, for example, they've investigated hospitals, patient-doctor interviews, and how firemen and policemen work with the people they interact with. And then they take those and use them as training sessions for like new firemen and new policemen and new nurses, because they can now look at the real thing. So I think that sense is simply being realistic about what do you do when you go to a restaurant. It is a natural question. That's a difficult term. Okay, let me think of that in the back while I'm looking at Peggy Tsai's. I say we teach conversations from a CA approach. How should we go about evaluating student performance? Very good question. And it's a general question that we can have with the idea of communicative language teaching. If we move to communicative language teaching, if we're doing CLIL lessons, how do we evaluate language development on that basis? One, we can use a kind of like, instead of typical test questions with A, B, C, D, or right and wrong answers, we can go to a more rubric-based approach where you have a kind of grid, and you might have several different features that you're interested in looking at. And it could be, for example, turn-taking proficiency, producing the right second pair part, whatever it is that you want to be looking at as a indicator of competence. Then you could have just kind of like 1 through 5 grid. And you say, on that level, I'm going to give that person a 3. I'm going to give this person a 4, give that person a 1. And then they get a combined score for everything that's on the grid. I think probably people have worked with those sort of grading rubrics before. Often you use them for grading presentations and things like that. I do think you can be more holistic as well. Like, another type of grading goes with band descriptors. And it's like, band 1 generally looks and sounds like this. Band 2 generally looks and sounds like this, and so on. Now, starts to become difficult when you get to say, yeah, but the school wants an A, B, C, D. What grades do you have there in Taiwan, Jane? Do you have number grades, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or do you have A, B, C, D, F?
Number grades.
Number grades.
Well, for elementary school, I think they're We have number grades for the tests, but not on the final report.
Okay. Now the British international school that my children went to in Oman, they didn't give grades, and instead, every report gave the individual things they could do. So, for example, it would say in math, can count from 1 to 10, can count from 10 to 1, knows which number is larger, knows can add this to this. It's very, very specific. Then
Yeah.
we moved to Mexico, and we had to have a Spanish translation of their grades, and we had that all translated, official stamped and everything, and we gave it to the authorities at the Mexican school, and they said, "What's this? Where are the grades? We can't work with this." So that was a bit of a problem. But yeah, I do think standardized tests become a problem. There are people, by the way, that are looking at assessments, like they're looking at oral interviews, but using CA as a method to analyze those oral assessments. I think at this point, that's basically research papers. Okay, let's look at the next question. Something, Boon?
And that's Johnny, Professor Johnny.
Okay, if we take actual CA data into account and discover that many interactions are in fact are not in fact interactional, then there is another standard by which we could evaluate speaking. And what would that standard rubric look like? Okay, first of all, we've said this idea of interactional versus transactional in the past, or maybe social and transactional. What they've really found is that those are inseparable. Every transactional interaction that you are ever engaged at the post office or the bank or whatever it is, you are at that same time being all of these various things, that the social you is there at all times. There are no moments in interaction where we turn off our social being. And this is how you might be perceived of as being aggressive or rude or passive when you're at the bank. So that's an important thing to say. There is no purely transactional language in that pure sense. But the rubric, as far as, again, I think there you're talking about what's the goal of your classroom. Are you looking at your elementary school kids, wanting them to be interacting in a sort of fluid sort of way? Then look at the features of fluidity that are relevant at a particular stage. And I say certainly turn taking is a key aspect in that initial stage. Timing, are they participating at the right moments? Oh yeah, I see that sort of. I meant to say transactional, but yeah, sort of what I've said there. There's no separation between transactional. Transactional makes it easier to write kind of true or correct or incorrect questions, where you have something like, Johnny went to the store. Johnny wanted to buy 4 apples. The man at the store said he only had, X apples. That's it's easier to write a question with that. But I think the grid style grading sheet or band descriptor is probably the way to go. And if you have multiple, so instead of having a small number of those, or rather large number, sorry, take that back. Instead of having 1, 2, or 3 in the whole semester, imagine that every week or every couple of weeks, you're doing something that involves one of those band descriptions. And so at the end, you might have 10 of those band descriptions. And I think that's a legitimate basis for providing a grade. Okay.
Okay. I've actually got something that I want to show you.
Okay.
It's I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before.
Okay, let's see.
This was one of my students.
Now see, you have specifically grayed them out for their own privacy
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so that's perfectly fine. So let me take a quick look there. What's wrong with you? I have a cold. Okay.
So
What's
it's
wrong with you? Okay. Now, by the way, what's wrong with you could have an alternate meaning there, right?
Yeah. And so this was like more than 10 years ago when I was observing in her class. She was
Uh-huh.
interning at an elementary school, for like half a year of internship. And then
Okay.
I was there to give her feedback on her teaching. And I thought this was totally wrong because she was talking to a puppet monkey, and with this dialogue, what's wrong with you? I have a cold. What's wrong with you? I have a fever, or something like that. And I said, how can you teach this to the students? What's wrong with you has a negative connotation, a negative meaning.
Well, first of all, you'd say, in this case, you'd say there's the primary designation, which I think is actually this one. And we might think of this in terms of a parent asking a child or a doctor asking the child, what's wrong with you? Although I may put the with you in parentheses in there. So what's wrong? I have a cold. What's wrong is doesn't have that same negative connotation.
Yes.
So what's wrong? I have a cold. What's wrong? I have a fever, and so on. But putting this in the context of a doctor and a patient, doctor and the child, I think would help. And of course, here's the thing: that the sound, the enactment. So what's wrong with you? That's the complaining one.
Yeah.
So you'd have to make sure that how you say things is also understood. What's wrong? I would also say, like, well, what's the problem?
It's a conversation in the textbook between a husband and a wife, but I don't know if you know 牛魔王 and 铁扇公仔.
Now, by the way, is this a whole conversation, or is it presented in these little teeny 2-line bits?
It was a like comic book, like or picture paired with conversations.
So like you'd have a whole kind of grid with maybe multiple pictures.
So it was a dialogue. The text would, the unit would begin with a dialogue between two people, a husband and a wife.
Okay, so there was a dialogue.
There was a dialogue first, yes.
Okay,
and
so my impression, actually my take on dialogues is we should by and large stop using them. So dialogues never reoccur. Any particular dialogue is somehow the artifact, I like to call it the byproduct, left behind from the process of interaction, and will virtually never co-occur as it is. The chance that 10 lines of dialogue will ever be repeated is astronomically small. On the other hand, the chance that what's wrong with you, I have a cold, that's very high frequency. These individual bits, I like to call those mini logs. So mini logs, I think, are quite good. Maybe, focus on the mini logs and kind of move away from the dialogues.
Mm-hmm. Well,
like what was wrong and what was next in this one? If this was a dialogue, what's wrong with you? I have a cold.
Yeah, and then I forgot what was next, but the sentence pattern drilling was this sentence pattern. And my feeling with this is we're teaching the kids the wrong question to ask when you spot somebody not feeling good,
So I think for my main feeling is like, what's wrong by itself.
But
if you could.
So, but they were taught what's wrong with you for like 10 years, and this was the activity, the information gap. They were to A would be asking what's wrong with you, and B would be answering, I have a cold or I have fever, whatever
Yeah.
symptom.
So yeah, I mean, do you have that's a great sort of follow-on, because like I have a cold. Okay, yeah. Is there a headache that's going along with that cold? So this is very much a kind of doctor-patient type interview.
Yeah, but
so what's wrong? Like, what's the problem today? So I think the idea of presenting alternate possibilities is useful. So what's wrong with you is not bad. What's wrong is maybe a little more standard. I have a cold. Again, that's fine.
yeah. So they changed it, the second edition to this textbook. They changed it to what's wrong, and I think it's much better than what's wrong with you.
What's wrong? Okay.
They
And let's go back for a moment to the yes, I do, no, I don't for the headache. And I said I don't like those. But again, you'd say within the context of a formal doctor-patient interview, you may get more of these kind of like a police interview type thing. But even then, I'd say maybe you would tend to, if you actually looked at it, you'd get other things. Do you have a headache? Yes. Every morning. Yes, all the time. Yes, it's really bad. Yes, it hurts. No, not all the time, or even just like a no, maybe it's stretched out.
Oh yeah, that would be a more natural like response.
Yeah, so just kind of realizing the yes, I do, no, I don't. I don't want to say they don't occur. That's wrong. They do occur, but they're rare. They're doing something special. So the teacher can then say, well, what might be the more natural occurring one here?
Yeah,
okay.
That's a great suggestion. So, so it wasn't in the textbook. It wasn't a dialogue between a doctor and a patient. It was a dialogue between a husband and a wife.
Okay.
And so they were teaching this to kids, so that when they spot somebody not feeling well, they could ask, "What's wrong with you?" And I thought that would be wrong too. It's a wrong question to ask. And also, I presented this information to a group of grad students at my university. There were foreign students, and one of the students from U.S. commented that in the States, you would ask what's wrong, and you would, not feeling well, but you wouldn't go into details of, do you have a headache? Do you have a fever? That sort of personal information.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is like, again, how are you feeling? I'm not feeling well. I get the stronger impression that this is more, again, telling a health professional. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That, there may be times, although in this case, a child is almost certainly going to be with the parent. But, in the US, it's very common to have a parent who doesn't speak English, and the child has to deal with their own English skills when interacting with the English-speaking doctor. But this is very much more of a kind of formal patient-doctor interview rather than, oh, by the way, how are you feeling? Not so good. You wouldn't go into like what specifically. Okay, I'm wondering here whether it'd be worthwhile to go back to the part of my presentation that dealt with making textbooks more realistic, because that seems to be what people are looking at here. I kind of put that off. So let me jump back into that a moment.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
There's a good question. What kind of discoveries are being made with the in the wild CA?
Let's see. First, there was I'm trying to think of the actual. There was a whole issue of, was it modern language teaching? But a whole issue that was dealt exclusively with CA observation of actually being able to document learning happening. At least that was the goal of each of the papers in that that edition. It was a special edition. I think it might have been the Modern Language Journal. And it was seeing line by line learning happening. And that's not an easy thing to do. The learning in the wild, it's hard to summarize that because they're really talking about a lot of different things. So it's not like they've come up with one conclusion to say, this is how learning in the wild happens, but just saying, we know how institutional learning happens. Let's maybe look at some alternate view. There have been also maybe some special issues there. I'd have to look that up to tell you the truth. Okay, let me go back to that part of the presentation. Okay, quickly we'll kind of run through what we've already done. Just a quick kind of thing here. Okay, we're talking about how to get those textbook dialogues more to natural phrase. Now, I like to say, don't think about rewriting them, because writing is part of the problem. The fact that dialogues are written is the thing that keeps them from being real. So instead, I like to use this word reimagining. Imagine how they would happen in real life. And then we're avoiding the kind of ridiculousness of these unnatural things. Okay, and we came up with this, which again, on the surface looks fairly good. We started looking at this one. We said, well, the first thing we can do is we can break it down and say what's unnatural on a superficial level, and this is the use of a single tense. So this is a grammar drill. This is not a dialogue. So very important. As long as the teacher recognizes this is a grammar drill, and if he wants to do a grammar drill, that's fine, but it's not a conversation. Okay. But if we want to turn it into more of a conversation, one of the first things we can do is unpack the TCU. So what are the units in this construction? In this case, I've put the slash, the red slash, where these can be separated. Hello, hey, Kelly, it's Emily, what are you doing? And so on. Now, once we've broken it up, now we can start to imagine how we could sort of rearrange those. Like, hello, hey, Kelly. And then maybe a silence, because normally if you say, hey, Kelly, Emily should be able to recognize who Kelly is just from her voice. Like if your son calls, if your brother calls, if your best friend calls, you should be able to recognize who that is just from them saying, hey. If you can't, then there's already a problem. So probably a silence. Hello, hey, Kelly. Silence. It's Emily. Maybe another silence, because there's no next person self-selects. So somebody self-selects and say, what are you doing? It could be the caller. Okay, so once we break it down, we can talk about who might speak next. Okay, now let's see if I've done this. Okay, now I've done this here, and I've applied the turn-taking rules, the SSJ turn-taking rules. So let's look at that. So first of all, we have the ring, 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 which is a summons. And then we have a reply, and it becomes hello. Hey, Kelly. Rule 1B, that doesn't select the next. So the silence there suggests the person was not recognized. So Emily self-selects and self-identifies. It's Emily. And then Kelly comes up with, oh, hi, Emily. So we've inserted the oh and the excited voice because Kelly has committed a sort of social error. She hasn't recognized her friend. And the O is somehow compensating for that. And then Emily comes up with, what are you doing? Now, if somebody calls me up on the phone and says, what are you doing? I will probably hear that as a pre-invitation, not a question. I'll hear it as a pre-invitation. They invite me to do something. And this is how I've reimagined Kelly doing it. She goes, nothing much. I'm just studying. So studying, it's not an important thing. I'm just studying. And then there's a silence. It's like, where's the invitation? I was expecting you to invite me. Nothing much. I'm just studying. Do you want to go to the movie? But that didn't happen. So instead we have a silence there, half-second silence. Now Kelly turns that around. What are you doing? Maybe see if we can dig that up. Me? Oh, I'm studying too. No uptake. Because I'm like, well, kind of like, why are you calling me? What are you studying? Okay, rule 1C. Next speaker self-selects. English. Nothing much to that. How about you? How about you? So rule 1A, that is, they have been selected. And actually, we've had a short amount of time here, but I want to say you can take your rules of turn taking and apply them all through the textbook dialogue to give you some ideas for how it might actually happen. Why would this person speak next? You can ask yourself. And maybe there'd be a silence because of that. Okay, let's look at another example. This comes from a textbook. Are you hungry? Hungry? I'm starving. Do you like pizza? No, not really. Do you like Chinese food? Yes, I do. I love it. Let's have dumplings. Great idea. Okay, let's go. Okay, now it's not horrible, but we can make it more visually simple for the students to understand this by putting it into blocks. So there's one. Are you hungry? That's a pre-sequence followed by a go ahead. Actually, I've got this on the next slide, so let me just go through. So this is what we have if we block it out. Are you hungry? Hungry, I'm starving. So pre-invitation number 1, upgraded, go ahead. Do you like pizza? Anthony's pre-invitation number 2. But a silence, that's an indication of an upcoming block. And not really, not so much. It's not my favorite. So hedged format, dispreferred, non-type conforming, reply. This leads to a brief silence. So, and then we have rule 1C. That is, Beth was speaking before. After silence, Beth speaks again. This time she gives a pre-invitation. Do you like Chinese food? That's her invitation. Anthony does a strong go ahead upgrade, replacing yes, I do with, oh, I love it. And then we have the invitation acceptance. Let's have dumplings. Great idea. And then the sequence closing third. Okay, let's go. Now, presented in this format, I think students can see what's happening here far more apparently than if we go back and say, compared with this kind of presentation is better. And so this is almost like a recommendation for people that want to write textbook materials, or if you want to write your own dialogue, imagine putting them like this. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see if there's any one last. I'll just mention this. So any particular real world conversation is the byproduct, the precipitate left behind, so to speak, of 2 or more people engaged in social interaction. It's like these footprints in the sand. It's what's left over. It's not the people dancing that made them. As such, the chance of any particular conversation would ever reoccur as it did is astronomically unlikely. Okay, so we can take any dialogue and we can start breaking it down, applying the rules, looking for alternative ways that it might work. So going from there to something that might look like that or like that. Okay, I'll stop share here. We got 10 minutes to have some final questions and comments.
I can imagine those blocks can be like, you know, the Taiwanese textbooks for, you know, elementary schools are shown in like a comic type of.
Yeah.
So those blocks could be one picture. So that.
Yeah, I agree. And some of the problems I often have with the textbooks that do that blocks, they don't do the blocks properly. You know, kind of like the turns they have in there aren't actually like the adjacency pairs they should be.
Yeah.
Or it's like they'll have that, like, here's the question, but then the answer is over in the next box.
Oh.
But in principle, that's not a bad thing, a nice way of presenting it. And I think the idea of presenting small bits, like in that textbook you showed me, that's really what you want to do. The whole idea of having students work with a whole conversation, I think is just not really useful.
Thank you. That's a wonderful
okay.
Suggestion. So any questions?
I wish I had immediate reference that I could just type in here for CA in the wild, although let me quickly go to Google and see whether that results in something. 1 second. Language learning in the wild. Okay. Okay, here we go. It was a whole project that was set up, and you can kind of explore that. Here's a website. This has links to some of the individual projects that people were engaged in.
Thank you.
And let me do another search. Let's see.
I think I came up, I have another question, because right now we're doing EMI classes or CLIL classes. EMI for university, at the university level, CLIL classes for elementary, middle, high school. And what we observe is, like, our students, because of the lack of English proficiency, they might not be conversing in English when they're doing group work. And how do we?
First of all, you say there's 2 parts there to say. They might not be conversing, but are they responding to English? So, for example, if other members of the group are saying, hand me that, and they're saying it in English, but they're responding back in their L1, then that's already a first step. Now, if they really cannot even receive the English, that's, like a whole lower level of competency. I think I'd be willing to allow the students to use Chinese to like scaffold that lower learner up, but rather than, as long as the student doesn't like simply never bother to engage, just saying the other people will do it for me. I put in another link. This is for what's called CARM. This stands for CA role-playing methodology. So this is a CA take on role play. So role plays are notoriously unnatural. If you just pick a student and say, pretend you work at McDonald's, pretend you're a customer, what they will produce will be very unnatural. So instead, this is primarily being done with professions at this point, but you're going and you're recording natural occurrences, and then you're feeding that back into the role play activity. So this is one particular researcher. That website kind of gives an introduction to that. This would be more for adults or perhaps high school level.
Thank you.
Well,
And so
yep.
before like it's almost 12, but before we go, or can we grab a group photo?
Yeah, sure.
This has been a wonderful.
Yes, good point. So person just said, possible that we access Professor Carroll's PowerPoint. I am absolutely going to put this up, but I haven't put it up yet because I don't know what the best way. There's SlideShare, right?
Yes.
That's just like an on, but I don't know if there's a better way to do that.
And
then the second question, really more addressed to you, Jane, and that is, if I put it up someplace, how can we distribute where that link is?
We have all the participants' emails, so we could send them your SlideShare.
Okay.
So
let me tentatively say, in the next week, I will put this up on SlideShare, or if I find something better, I might ask Vance whether he has some
learning
snappier sort of thing.
Yeah.
But so SlideShare or someplace else. Worst case scenario, I'll just be able to take the whole PowerPoint file and upload that to someplace. There is another link. Hold on a second. One more. Okay.
Yeah, please get your cameras. Get ready to give.
Yeah. So there is another link that I've actually put up a lot of stuff on, and like all my little booklet is there, and other people put their stuff there, and somehow I get that link out. Maybe I'll add as a slide to my PowerPoint, and then that will be in the PowerPoint, and people can go to that link and actually download materials as well. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. I know this has been kind of a hard grind. This is a lot of tough new material 4 weeks in a row, but I really appreciate everybody who's joined us.
Yes, so, I really appreciate Dr. Don Carroll. I really enjoyed all 4 sessions and have learned a lot. And through CA, we could analyze our textbooks and the dialogues, and perhaps talk about presenting in a better way or a more accurate way, or even conducting CA for my
I hope at least some of this is sort of a mind-blowing kind of thing. So
yes, to me it is.
Thank you very much, and I'll let you know as soon as I have that PowerPoint up.
Okay.
The group photo camera's on. Group photos,
on, please. Okay, one.
Let's see. Is that way? CA? Was that a CA? Okay. Let's see.
I need my hands on it. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much for coming for all and attending all 4 weeks. And thank you, Dr. Carroll, for giving us this wonderful webinar series.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. And if you will please fill out the survey and give us some feedback. It's we very much appreciate your feedback so that we could offer more webinars on topics that you need. Thank you.